I mean, they're going to stand up no matter who plays them, but they're nothing like how we wound up playing. Me with my no drum training whatsoever, just bashing away, made a huge difference. Sterling with his real solid rhythm playing, and John with his manic viola. Lou would go off on a tangent, and Cale would go off on a tangent, and if someone wasn't holding it all down, it would just be this massive confusion. So I would concentrate on just playing the same beat we started at, and just keep it under there, so when everybody came back, there was something to go back to.
Hey everybody, I'm Cam Forrester, and this is my documentary on Maureen Tucker, legendary drummer of the Velvet Underground. This video is a somewhat belated 100 subscriber special for you. 100 odd subscribers may not seem like a big deal, but it is to me since I'm really only just getting started here on YouTube, so it's my way of saying a little thank you to everybody who's shown an interest and supported my channel so far, and on this occasion, the user Silver Wolf in particular, who specifically requested the subject of this video, which is something I've always wanted to cover since nobody has before in any comprehensive way, and I for one believe it's well deserved and long overdue. Now, as I mentioned before in my previous video, How to Play Venus in Furs, I first heard of Maureen Tucker when I began learning to play the drums way back in 2004 when I was 12, as there was an information segment about her in the first drum tuition book that I got. This prompted me to go out and buy a copy of the Velvet Underground and Nico, the band's groundbreaking debut album, and it's safe to say that after listening to it, I never quite heard music in the same way again. Despite having no musical training whatsoever, Maureen, or Mo as she was known, became an asset to the Velvet Underground and an absolutely integral part of the band's unique sound. She has influenced many artists across the globe through her simple and instinctive approach to playing the drums. Rock critic Robert Christgau went so far as to say that Mo's drumming changed history and is where the punk notion of how the beat works begins. In this documentary we're going to look at what was so unusual and so special about Mo's playing and why her sound still resonates so widely today. Maureen Ann Tucker was born in Queens, New York in 1944 and grew up in a suburb called Levittown on Long Island. She was a lover of music from a young age, and through listening to radio shows such as Murray the K's Swingin' Soiree, together with the influence of her older brother Jim, was introduced not only to rock and roll but also world music, most pertinently Babatunde Olatunji, a Nigerian drummer whose music became successful in the USA, whom she would become a big fan of, buying his album Drums of Passion, and later actually having the surprise chance of seeing him perform in person at her own high school with his full ensemble and team of dancers. Mo also loved the music of Bo Diddley, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and after hearing Not Fade Away on the radio in her car one evening, she realised that merely listening to records wasn't enough for her anymore. She wanted to interact somehow and to play along with the beat. So in 1963, at the age of 19, she went out and bought herself a snare drum, a cymbal and some sticks, and started practicing along to albums at home. Mo's mother was delighted and encouraged her daughter's newfound drumming hobby, which as a drummer I can tell you is a rare thing among parents of would-be percussionists, and later saw an ad in the newspaper for a used drum kit priced at $50, which she went out and bought for her. Mo began practicing on her new drum kit in her bedroom each night to unwind after getting home from work, having got a job as a key punch operator for IBM after having dropped out of Ithaca College. The kit was a 1950s Gretsch round badge outfit in white marine pearl and consisted of a bass drum with rail mount tom-tom, an L-arm mounted cymbal, a snare drum with a stand, a floor tom and a hi-hat cymbal. Whilst listening to the playing of Charlie Watts and Ringo Starr, two drummers who were known for their simple yet effective playing and precise timing, she developed a strong sense of timekeeping and discipline with regards to playing the song and not the instrument. Before long, she and some colleagues from work who also played instruments formed an all-girl trio called The Intruders, rehearsing and covering popular songs, and eventually playing a gig. The band was to be short-lived, however, due to a somewhat egotistical singer bringing down the other band members. After they broke up, Mo returned to practicing away in her bedroom by herself. Meanwhile, in December 1965, an aspiring avant-garde rock band called the Velvet Underground managed to land their first paid gig at Summit High School in New Jersey. The band consisted of singer-songwriter and guitarist Lou Reed, classically trained multi-instrumentalist and viola prodigy John Cale, rhythm guitarist Sterling Morrison, and percussionist Angus MacLeese. And together, up to that point, they had only played for tips at Cafe Watt in New York. The new gig opportunity was to unexpectedly cost the band their percussionist, who considered the concept of starting to play and then stopping at specified times in exchange for money to be an outrage and a sellout, and reacted by leaving the band abruptly. In Lou Reed's words, this was the 60s. Following MacLeese's departure, the band were desperate to find a replacement drummer in time for this first gig, so Sterling, who was close friends with Moe's brother Jim, put forward the statement, "Tucker's sister plays drums." Lou and Moe met briefly in passing before whilst he was hanging out with Sterling and Jim, but they'd never exchanged more than a few words. But since the band really had no time to be advertising or auditioning people, Lou asked Sterling to contact Jim and have him ask Moe if she'd be interested in playing with them. After hearing back that she was interested, Lou went right on over to the Tucker house to find out if Moe could really play, which she could, and then asked her for real to play this gig with the band. She agreed, so the band later rehearsed with her at John's Ludlow Street apartment in Manhattan, and then played the gig as the warm-up act for local headliners The Middle Class. It's often believed that Moe played her drums standing up with the bass drum turned on its side using mallets from the outset, but this was not the case. When Moe first started playing with the Velvet, she had her drum kit set up conventionally and played using a bass drum pedal while sat on a stool. For that first gig, the Velvets were allowed to play 3 songs which turned out to be I'm Waiting for the Man, Heroin and Venus in Furs. Moe later recalled being incredibly nervous and that parts of her drum kit started coming loose during the performance. The bass drum pedal during one song, causing the beater to fall in its shackle, and the floor tom leg in another, causing the drum to drop down. She kept on playing though and said that she didn't think anyone else in the band even noticed because they were all so nervous. The Velvets left their teenage audience somewhat bemused by the shocking music they performed that night, but managed to land another gig very soon after, this time a short residency at the Café Bizarre in Greenwich Village. It was never formally discussed at any point that Moe was now a member of the band, yet nor was it ever declared otherwise. She just kept on turning up when needed, and after a short time became a vital member of the band that would later prove impossible to substitute. Despite this, Moe still never saw herself as a professional musician. There were never any major aspirations behind her late-night bedroom practicing other than mere recreation. She just happened to now be playing with friends and having fun while it lasted. The Café Bizarre would not allow a full drum kit to be played because of the volume, so for the next string of gigs Moe played only a tambourine. But rules regarding what the band were and were not allowed to do were about to immediately become history, as in the audience of that gig was Barbara Rubin, an associate of the famous artist Andy Warhol, who was on the lookout for a band to take part in a multimedia show concept he'd been planning, which later became known as the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. Barbara rushed to inform Andy about the band after seeing them perform, and brought him and the rest of his entourage back to the venue to see their next set, which was the night that they were infamously fired for playing the Black Angels' Death Song once more, after previously being warned never to play it again by the venue manager. Andy was impressed with Lou's risque lyrics and the band's savagely raw sound, and thought that they'd fit in perfectly with what he was trying to put together, so he offered to become their manager and to help raise their profile and exposure through his own platform and influence. The first step in these proceedings was him inviting them over to his studio called The Factory, which was on East 47th Street in Midtown Manhattan. It would be fair to say that the band, and Moe in particular, were somewhat starstruck, suddenly being given the opportunity to work and hang out with a world-famous artist like Andy Warhol and his weird but wonderful crowd of followers, fellow artists, celebrities, downtown bohemian socialites, drag queens and street hustlers. Mo later recalled that she would often find herself meeting eyes with Martha, her friend and the future wife of Sterling Morrison, who would hang out with the band a lot of the time, from across a room, and that they'd exchange a look of both amusement and total disbelief at their surroundings. Lou already had a strong body of work written, including songs that dated back to his college days at Syracuse University, where he studied creative writing under the mentor Delmore Schwartz. However, Andy was insistent that he work harder and write more, using the new environment as inspiration, and also persuaded him to write some songs for Nico, a stunning German actress, model, and singer who had recently become a factory regular and whom Andy believed would help attract the band more media attention if they'd allow her to perform with them as a chanteuse. Lou was initially reluctant to this idea, but after some discussion with the rest of the band and befriending Nico herself, they all agreed to trial the idea on a temporary basis. Andy was very generous to the band. He not only allowed them to rehearse and perform at the factory, but he also bought them better equipment and made many films of them, individually as screen tests and as a band whilst they were rehearsing or goofing around at the factory, all in preparation for the upcoming EPI shows. These shows, which started as a residency at the Dom in New York but eventually became a sporadic tour of the USA and Canada, consisted of the band playing live on stage with their films and screen tests projected upon them and around the rest of the venue, together with dancers on the stage acting out choreographed themes based on the song lyrics, and a psychedelic light show designed by Danny Williams, which heavily influenced light shows that would later be used at other events such as the Monterey International Pop Festival and at venues such as the Fillmore Auditorium. The brightness of the projections and stroboscopic lights aimed at the stage forced the band to resort to wearing shades whilst performing. Mo later recalled how at the time she'd often wished she could have been out there in the audience experiencing the shows rather than playing them, as they must have been really quite interesting. The now legendary events became notorious as a freak-out experience and quickly gained popularity, helping the band reach a wider and more diverse audience, including other artists, celebrities, and music journalists. However, the increased media attention often resulted in harshly critical write-ups in the press because the avant-garde music and adult themes in the lyrics were unheard of and caused great controversy at the time. As this period of development continued, Mo was still living and working out on Long Island, whereas the rest of the band stayed mostly in Manhattan, either at the factory or John's Ludlow Street apartment. She would borrow her mother's car and drive into the city to play shows, hang out and rehearse with the rest of the band, and then stay over on weekends either at the factory, John's, or occasionally by renting accommodation nearby. Mo had a somewhat androgynous or tomboyish appearance, having a shorter hairstyle and often wearing plain or dark clothes, together with the shades the band had started wearing more and more. Her individual look photographed well, and though she stood out among the rest of the factory crowd at the time, most of whom also had their own unique styles, she somehow looked and more importantly felt like she belonged, despite not really knowing or relating to many of the individuals around her in perhaps the way the rest of the band were able to, spending so much more time there than her. Mo recalled never feeling out of place or unwelcome and insists that she was never criticised by anybody, either for her appearance or the fact that she was totally uninterested in the drug culture that was very much a part of the factory scene. She would stick to her beer and cigarettes and have a good time with everybody else with no judgments passed either way. She also claims to have never experienced any notable remarks regarding being a female drummer, and believes that it's seen as a bigger deal today than it ever was back then, which is surprising considering that the only other notable female drummers of that decade were Honey Landry of the British pop band The Honeycombs, who had some hit singles between 1964 and 1966. And Karen Carpenter, who rose to prominence in the late 60s along with her brother Richard as the stars of the sensational act The Carpenters. Mo was still playing her $50 Gretsch drum kit, which by now had a few broken skins from heavier playing than what she'd been previously doing back in her bedroom. This was remedied with duct tape, as can be seen in most photos from that early factory period, or by turning the drums upside down to use the other skin until she could afford to replace the broken ones. During rehearsal jams, which were becoming progressively longer and increasingly experimental, she would concentrate on providing a minimalistic foundation, a simple, prominent rhythm that would create a base for the rest of the band to lift off from and then return back to after going off on erratic tangents. She also started experimenting with the use of mallets on her bass drum, at first playing from the side, similar to marching bass drum fashion but while sat on the floor, before then placing the drum flat on the floor and playing from above in timpani fashion. The band encouraged her use of unusual techniques, and she began likening the sound she was getting from playing this way, abandoning the use of her cymbal for the most part, to the music of Olatunji, and in particular with the song Heroin, which had previously been a folk song with light pitter-patter bongo rhythms played by Angus MacLeese. She felt that this deeper, more dynamically powerful African-influenced sound fitted much better with the music than anything she had played using a conventional setup. In photos, and the all too few films that there are of the band during this period, it's a struggle to actually see Mo a lot of the time, as she is often hidden either behind other band members or equipment cluttering the small stages they were playing. What also didn't help was that she was almost constantly playing her drums down on the floor at this point too, in preference to the unconventional sound. In April 1966, Andy paid for the band to book in at Scepter Studios in New York to record tracks for their first album, and Mo's playing was laid down onto tape for the first time. She was incredibly excited to be in a studio making a record, but was also very nervous as the band were on a tight budget and only had a limited time of 8 hours, spread out in slots over 4 days, to get everything down. It's on these first recordings that we get to hear Mo experimenting with different ways of playing percussion, since this was before she settled into the style of playing that she has since become most known for. The acetate that was cut from the master tapes of these recordings was sent to the A&R departments of Columbia, Elektra and Atlantic Records, but all three rejected it, again with harsh criticism. Andy eventually managed to negotiate a deal with the MGM subsidiary label Verve Records, which allowed free rein over the production of the material, an agreement that was made purely because of his association with the band and based on the strength of his popularity at that time. Producer Tom Wilson had worked at Columbia at the time the acetate was reviewed, and is rumoured to have heard it before moving jobs to MGM shortly before the band was signed to Verve. So it's likely that he helped facilitate this deal, since his enthusiasm for the band's music is well known and documented. After they were signed, he stepped in and encouraged them to re-record the three most prominent tracks, I'm Waiting for the Man, Heroin and Venus in Furs, from the Scepter acetate, at TTG Studios in Hollywood while they were on the EPI tour, feeling that the original performances could be improved upon. While the performance, fidelity and mix is undeniably better on the re-recorded tracks, Mo was mortified by the decision to use the TTG take of Heroin on the album, as during the song's chaotic climax when the amps were blasting at full power, she could no longer hear where the other band members were in the song through the wall of sound in the room, and eventually stopped playing thinking they would too. Lou can be heard laughing in response and nodded her to come back in, emphasising the three words, "And thank God that I'm good as dead," and they saw the song through to the end. Although in reality it was a mistake, the sudden stop of the drums actually adds to the frenzied climax, as if reaching a point of complete mental breakdown or mind split open from the point of view of the character in the song. The band recorded one last additional song, Sunday Morning, at Mayfair Studios in New York in November, and made a few minor adjustments to the pre-existing Scepter tracks before finally submitting the album for release. It's because of Andy's insistence upon the band to ignore negative criticism and not allow outside influences to affect their approach to the music or lyrics that the album was released as it was. He protected them in a way that certainly no other record company, and perhaps even no other manager, would have ever done so at the time. It is for this reason that he was credited as producer on the album. In reality, he had no input or influence on the actual production of the music, but his shielding of the band from the seemingly outraged music industry has been consistently acknowledged by the band members since as a legitimate form of production in and of itself. Here's a track-by-track analysis of Mo's playing on the album. On Sunday morning, Mo was playing her kit in a conventional setup with a bass drum pedal, pattering lightly on her cymbal and snare drum with brushes.
Brings the dawn in. It's just a restless feeling by my side.
On the Scepter take of I'm Waiting for the Man, she only played a tambourine, but on the TTG take that made the final album, she played her bass drum and snare from above down on the floor, with Martha holding up the snare to keep it from moving away while she was playing. Femme Fatale was tambourine with a stick and snare with a brush. Both takes of Venus in Furs were bass drum and tambourine played from above down on the floor. Run 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 is played entirely on the snare, her right hand playing the ghost notes towards the outside of the skin, and her left hand playing the accents. All Tomorrow's Parties, like Venus in Furs, was bass drum and tambourine on the floor. Both takes of Heroin were played using the bass drum on the floor, with tom-toms either side for different tone colours, and also a tambourine in the Scepter take. There She Goes Again was played entirely on the snare. I'll Be Your Mirror was tambourine only, played in hand. The Black Angels' Death Song had no percussion. And finally, European Sun was the same setup as Heroin. The first album was eventually released in March 1967 after almost a year of delays after the initial Scepter sessions, caused by label rejections, further recording sessions, and problems with the production of the peelable banana artwork sticker, only to then be recalled in June of that year thanks to a lawsuit filed by Eric Emerson, whose image was projected onto the back wall behind the band during an EPI performance, a photo of which was used for the reverse side of the album sleeve. Recalled copies were fitted with a large black sticker to cover the image, and reissued copies, released 5 months later in November, had an airbrushed version printed. These issues contributed to the record being largely unnoticed and selling poorly, despite favourable reviews from some of the few music critics who actually reviewed it following the release. The album was also instantly banned from several record stores and radio stations upon release because of the nature of the lyrical content alone, and the promotion and distribution efforts of Verve Records were lackluster at best. During this frustrating time, ironically, the band began playing larger concert halls such as the Gymnasium and the Boston Tea Party, since their following was still growing steadily and larger crowds were beginning to descend upon their shows. There was, however, a regular theme among the feedback received from somewhat confused fans, in that they couldn't find a copy of the record available anywhere. The band also parted ways with Nico that year, who left to pursue a solo career, the first album of which, Chelsea Girl, was also produced by Tom Wilson and featured music performances provided by Lou, John and Sterling. Andy managed to sign the band up for an endorsement deal with Vox Amplifiers. According to Sterling Morrison, the Velvets were the first American band to receive an endorsement from the British company, which meant that they were suddenly equipped with brand new and incredibly powerful solid-state amplifiers, effects pedals, and a Vox Continental organ, all free of charge. Meanwhile, however, Moe's tired old Gretsch drums were actually stolen from a venue between sets, so she had to resort to playing on large garbage cans taken from an outside alley until she could get a new drum kit. In Andy's 1967 experimental film of the band playing at the Boston Tea Party, filmed shortly before a frustrated Lou fired him as their manager, in preference to Steve Sesnick, hoping for a more informed and strategic direction towards commercial success, there are actually a few brief glimpses of Moe's new Sonor Teardrop drum kit in the striking finish of Aqua Satin Flame, which replaced her white marine pearl Gretsch kit that was stolen. It can also be seen that the drums were now being mic'd up into the PA system so that they could be heard well throughout the venue. This was the period where Moe's playing really started to mature into what has since become her signature upright style, and the Velvet Underground discovered the heavier and louder side to their sound. Moe had up to this point been propping her drums up with chairs so that she could stand and play comfortably. The band were no longer at practice amp volumes that allowed her to play gently while sat down on the floor. They were now at full concert volume, and she needed to be stood up so that she could lay into the drums with full force. A friend of the band noticed, however, that her bass drum would move around unsteadily under hard playing during the shows, and made a stand for her that held it up securely and gave the kit a more professional look. Moe also occasionally started using a modified bass drum pedal with this kit, which was chained backwards and risen up on a wooden box high enough for it to strike the underside of her bass drum, enabling her to play her ride cymbal and still be able to play the downbeats with her foot. Her kit now had the functionality of a conventional setup, whilst retaining the ability to play the bass drum in timpani fashion when desired. By all accounts, Moe and the rest of the band began having to closely watch each other during these larger and louder performances in order to keep track of where they were in the song and be ready for whatever was going to happen next, especially during improvised sections, because the lack of monitors in those days meant that the sheer volume of the new high-powered amplifiers would drown out everything but the speaker cabinet you were closest to, which in Moe's case was always Lou's guitar amplifier. She would fixate her vision to Lou's mouth during songs like Heroin, paying attention to where he was in the song by reading his lips, as she could not hear the vocals, which would have only been coming out of the front of house PA speakers. It's somewhat unfortunate that the band's second album, White Light, White Heat, was recorded when it was, in 1968, as since it was mostly recorded live, the thunderous Vox amplifiers completely overpowered the drums on the title track, and no matter how well it was mixed, the drums could not be brought up high enough to be clearly audible because the bleed from the other instruments was too high and would muddy the sound of the track even more.
I guess one of the things that affected the sound of the songs was that all the amps would be on at the same time, of course. And in those days they weren't so great with baffling and hiding things. So there'd be feedback or hissing and stuff that you really don't hear, but if that stuff was taken out, it would make a tremendous difference.
Moe's playing, although difficult to hear, is very aggressive in this recording, much like the others playing. It's also much different to how she would later play the song live. She ploughs eighth notes heavily into the bass drum with her right hand all the way through, except when hitting the cymbal on beats 2 and 4 of each bar, and with her left hand plays the snare simultaneously with each crash of the cymbal. The drums are totally non-existent in the mono mix, all you can hear is the cymbals faintly in the background. However, in the stereo mix you can hear the top end of the bass drum and the cymbal in the right channel, but the snare is barely audible underneath and the drums generally sound like cardboard. The best way to study her playing, and this applies to most of the album, is to listen to the right stereo channel in mono. Here's a demonstration of what she was actually playing in that performance.
Watch that side, don't you know, gonna be dead and right. Red foxy mama watching her walking down the street. White light, here comes, everybody get it, gonna make me run to it.
With the exception of her unusual drum setup, today there wouldn't appear to be anything particularly extraordinary about her playing on this track. However, this style of riding her bass drum with her right hand in the way that most drummers would ride a cymbal throughout the track created a different sound that was actually very innovative in rock drumming at that time, since most drummers would primarily only play the bass drum on beats 1 and 3 of each bar. There would sometimes be occasional accents or passing notes here and there, but certainly nothing as constant as the way Moe was beginning to play eighth notes across all 4 beats of every bar. An earlier example of similarly fast bass drum playing can be heard from 2 years prior, when The Who's drummer, Keith Moon, performed on the band's 1966 single Substitute, pumping eighth notes throughout most of the song using his bass drum pedal.
Substitute your lies for fact. I see right through your plastic Mac. I look all white, but my dad was black. My substitute is really made out of sack.
There may well be a link here to some extent, as the Velvets, particularly Lou and Moe, were quite influenced by noisy British rock groups such as The Who and The Kinks. And of course, The Who and the Velvet Underground, easily 2 of the loudest and most aggressive sounding rock groups of 1968, both unquestionably influenced the punk movement of the late 1970s. The controversial or anti-establishment lyrical themes, hard-hitting beat, and early use of feedback and noise being the primary reasons why. My personal favourite out of her performances on this record is without doubt I Heard Her Call My Name.
Here comes countdown. Gone, gone, gone. Got my eyes wide open.
Which is where we get to hear Moe lay into her, again barely audible but just about, drums. She really moves around the toms and plays fills like we haven't heard on any prior recordings, but no cymbals, and the song sounds so much better for it.
I know that you hear about me. I heard you call my name. And I know long dead and gone. Still it ain't the same. But when I wake up in this morning, mama, I heard her call my name. I know she's dead and gone, gone, gone. I heard her call my name, that I felt my mind spit over.
Convinced yet? It's genuinely hard to appreciate just how heavily Moe was playing on these tracks based on the recordings as they sound, but anyone questioning it should listen to the golden outtake from the White Light, White Heat era entitled Guess I'm Falling in Love. I personally would have gladly sacrificed a few of the 17 minutes that Sister Ray occupied on this record, and don't get me wrong, I love Sister Ray, just to finish and feature this fantastic song on the album, which actually highlights Moe's huge sounding drums in the mix, but sadly it didn't happen. Thankfully, the studio recorded instrumental track survived and was released on the outtake compilation album Another View in 1986. It's in this very recording that you can literally hear the seeds for punk rock being sown. After White Light, White Heat, tensions were growing between Lou and John due to their creative differences and desires to take the band into opposing directions. John wanted to carry on experimenting and pushing limits, whereas Lou wanted to take more of a conventional approach in hopes that the band might actually achieve some commercial success, since the first 2 albums had sold so poorly. There are varying accounts of precisely what caused Lou to finally force John out of the band by means of an either he goes or I go type ultimatum, but it was against the wishes of both Moe and Sterling. With a heavy heart, they reluctantly sided with Lou, faced with the reality of the band dissolving entirely, and John left in September 1968.
Well, when John left, it was really sad. I mean, you know, I felt really bad. And of course, this was going to really influence the music because John's a lunatic. But, you know, I think we became a little more normal, which was fine. It was good music, good songs. It was never the same, though. It was never the same. It was good stuff, a lot of good songs, but just the lunacy factor was gone.
At some point during this period, most of the band's equipment, including their Vox amplifiers, effects pedals, organ, and Lou's heavily modified Gretsch Country Gentleman electric guitar, were reportedly stolen from an airport whilst they were on tour. They managed to obtain replacements by signing a new endorsement deal with Sun Amplifiers, and both Lou and Sterling purchased new guitars. Mo also got a new drum kit around the same time, so it's likely her previous one was stolen along with all of the other equipment. Her new kit was another Gretsch, this time in a natural mahogany finish. It was the same configuration as her previous kit, although this time she added a second cymbal and a hi-hat to the setup. Just before the third album was recorded in late 1968, multi-instrumentalist Doug Yule joined the band, taking over from John on bass, organ and backing vocals. Thankfully, Doug was a very talented musician and fast learner, as the band was touring the US intensely around this point, and he had to pick up the material in a very short space of time. The regular live performances had gotten the band incredibly tight, so when they went into the studio to record The Velvet Underground, they were very well rehearsed and recorded the album mostly live with few overdubs. The new member, new equipment, and general desire from Lou to show a different side to the band all contributed to a much more delicate and spacious sounding third album, which brought Mo's drumming more to the forefront than ever before. For me, the highlight of this album in that respect is the track I'm Set Free, in which, in the Val Valentin mix more so than Lou Reed's Closet mix, we can practically feel Mo's drums since they're so upfront in the mix. Her playing on this track is simple, but incredibly powerful and dynamic, and it's almost certainly the best fidelity example of her signature upright style that exists on a recording.
I've been set free and I've been bound, and now I'm set free. I'm set free. I'm set free to find you will lose your
Other interesting styles on the album include the Murder Mystery, which showcases Mo pounding her way around the kit in what is really the only track on the album that even resembles the band's previous avant-garde experimental work.
Rappers and such too fantastic. Blind memories, one lovely, you'll see who in love with the flat-eyed pages. Watch the diamonds, Lord God gave me Sunday for the passion, but it justify my spirits and desires. Rectify moments, my serious narrative, take element the face of my odious.
Mo also sang lead vocals on the album track After Hours and outtake I'm Sticking With You, two songs that Lou had written with her in mind to sing, since he felt that they were too beautiful for his own voice. She was so nervous in the studio that after a few failed attempts at takes, she demanded everybody except Lou should leave, as she couldn't relax with them all watching her, and Sterling jokingly making fun of her through the control room window. The two songs have since become favourites among fans of the band, always appearing on best-of compilation albums and also later featuring in films and TV adverts because of the innocent, childlike quality to her singing on them.
If you close the door, the night could last forever. Leave the wine glass out and drink a toast to never. Oh, someday I know someone will look into my eyes and say, hello, you're my very special one. But if you close the door, I'd never have to see the day again.
By 1970, Mo was expecting her first child and had to take maternity leave from band duties, which sadly meant that she did not appear on the Velvet Underground's fourth and final studio album Loaded, despite being credited as the drummer. The drums on the album were in fact played by Doug Yule, Doug's brother Billy Yule, studio engineer Adrian Barber, and session musician Tommy Castanaro. Ironically, two of the Velvet's most famous tracks, Rock and Roll and Sweet Jane, appeared on this album and as such do not feature Mo as the drummer, but all band members have since expressed sincere regret for not waiting until Mo was able to play again, because the songs did not sound the same without her and the drummers who actually played on the record were too normal. When the band were playing a residency at Max's Kansas City that year, Mo went to see them perform with Billy Yule on drums and actually experienced the reality of this difference for the first time. On that same night, Lou took her aside and told her that he was quitting the band. She didn't ask him why, having got the impression that he'd clearly made up his mind, but it would appear to be a result of accumulated frustrations with the band's lack of commercial success, growing tensions between him and manager Steve Sesnick, and a desire to attempt at a solo career.
He was really, really upset, and we sat there for a while. I didn't put any questions to him or argue with him. I just, had obviously made his decision. He didn't give me any specific reasons why he had decided to leave.
The remaining members continued to tour the USA and Canada promoting Loaded, with a new lineup featuring Walter Powers on bass and Doug Yule now leading the band, but Sterling would also quit in August 1971 to be replaced by Willie Alexander, who would perform with them on a tour of Europe before the band completely dissolved in January 1972, after Mo herself finally quit the band and the music business altogether to raise her family following her recent marriage and relocation to Phoenix, Arizona. Over the next couple of decades, Mo dabbled back in and out of the music business, collaborating with other artists and recording her own solo material. After divorcing in the early 1980s and relocating to Douglas, Georgia, she began releasing solo albums and formed her own band, which at times would feature her fellow Velvets colleague Sterling Morrison on guitar. She also toured with the band Half Japanese and collaborated with several artists such as Jonathan Richman, Daniel Johnston, Mark Goodman, and her other Velvets colleagues Lou Reed and John Cale. Her final major return to the drums was in 1993 when the Velvet Underground briefly reunited for a tour of Europe. One of these shows, filmed over a 3-night residency at El Olympia in Paris, was recorded and filmed and later released as a live album and home video. Mo had a brand new kit put together by Tama Drums for the tour, which was similar in specification to her old Gretsch kits from back in the 60s, although she added a second tom-tom and a sizzle cymbal, 2 differently sized crash cymbals stacked one on top of the other to self-deaden each other. Although the band sounded radically different to the way they did in the 60s, since all of them were using more modern equipment, and Lou in particular was often using totally different vocal phrasing on a lot of the songs, Mo's performance was stellar. Her timing was spot on throughout, and her energy was mesmerising, especially during what can only be described as the heroic performance of the song Heroin.
It's my wife and it's my life, 'cause a meaner to my vein leads to a center in my head, and I'm better off than dead. From the smack, it gets so float, and I really don't care anymore about all you gingers in the town. Everybody putting everybody else down, and all the politicians making crazy sound, and all the dead bodies piled up in mound. Disappear, and I guess that I just don't know, and I guess that I just don't know.
It was very special for people to not only hear but to finally be able to actually see just how differently Mo played in comparison to other drummers, and also to see how both Sweet Jane and rock and roll were supposed to be played all along. The band also created a spectacle of Mo by bringing her up front to sing the songs I'm Sticking With You and After Hours at the shows, which was met with a fantastic crowd response.
I'm sticking with you, 'cause I'm made out of glue. Anything that you might do, I'm gonna do too. You held up a stagecoach in the rain, and I'm doing the same. Saw you hanging from a tree, and I made believe it was me. Oh, I'm sticking with you, 'cause I'm made out of glue. Anything that you might do, I'm gonna do too.
I'll do anything for you. Oh, oh, hey, I'm sticking with you. Oh, I'm sticking with you. Oh, I'm sticking with you.
was to be short-lived thanks to Lou and John falling out again, but it briefly enabled a new generation of fans to be able to see the Velvets perform and left a fantastic visual document of Maureen Tucker and Sterling Morrison's playing, which we would otherwise only be able to imagine. After the reunion, Moe's final major live appearance playing the drums was with Lou and John in 1996 during the induction of the Velvet Underground into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They gave an emotional performance of a tribute song entitled Last Night I Said Goodbye to My Friend, which all three of them lovingly wrote and dedicated to the late Sterling Morrison following his tragic succumbing to cancer in 1995.
I saw his face and cried last night. I wiped the tears from my eyes.
I sat with my friend, I kissed his cheek and held his hand.
Last night I said goodbye to my friend.
Always miss you, and that's the truth. We've been friends so long, and I love you. I can't believe this happened, it can't be real. I don't know what to do or say or feel.
Last night I said goodbye to my friend. Last night I said goodbye to my friend. Last night I said goodbye to my friend. Last night I said goodbye to my friend.
Since then, Moe has recorded further solo material, collaborated with other artists, and made occasional public appearances and provided interviews for various Velvets-related radio and TV shows. In more recent years, she has paid tribute via radio and newspaper interviews to her longtime friend and fellow Velvets colleague Lou Reed, who sadly passed away in 2013, and also appeared on stage with colleague John Cale in 2017 during the Grammy Salutes and Music Legends Awards ceremony, and provided interviews for the upcoming Todd Haynes documentary entitled The Velvet Underground, but otherwise has generally retired from the music business, prioritising her family life. Maureen Tucker's unique approach to playing the drums has influenced many artists all over the world, including myself, and it continues to do so as the years unfold and the musical legacy of the Velvet Underground inspires new generations of fans. Despite the band being commercially unsuccessful in their day, their influence has been acknowledged by the likes of David Bowie, Talking Heads, Joy Division, U2, R.E.M., Sonic Youth, The Smiths, Nirvana, Suede, The Strokes, Arctic Monkeys, and countless others. And Moe's distinctive rhythms were the foundation underneath it all.
To be honest, I would rather it be the way it is than us to have made $10 million. And it didn't matter. $10 million would be real nice, but honestly, it's great to go play somewhere and have a 18-year-old say, "Oh, I love your music, and you changed my life," and things like that. It's just really, wow, you know.
Echoes of Moe's primitive beat can be heard across most punk music, in particular the Scottish post-punk band The Jesus and Mary Chain, whose drummer Bobby Gillespie borrowed her style and simplified it to an even further extent, playing only a floor tom and a snare drum. Comparisons have also been made against the playing of Meg White of the Detroit alternative rock duo The White Stripes, whose similarly untrained minimalist style often harks back to Moe.
15 people telling me to move, I got moving on my mind. I found shelter in some thoughts turning wheels around. I said 39 times that I love you to the beauty I have found. Well, it's
It's hard to imagine what would have become of the band without her, and in the end it was proven beyond all doubt that nobody could take her place. While Loaded may have spawned some great songs, the record itself is void of one of the most essential ingredients that made up the Velvet Underground sound. Her style influenced me so much that I actually modified one of my drum kits so that I could play in the same upright fashion whilst recording drum parts for 3 songs on my own solo album. You just can't get that drum sound playing a conventional setup, and neither can you get that sound with a conventional drummer. Mo was a natural drummer, in perhaps the same way that Keith Moon was, just at opposite ends of the busy spectrum. Both drummers played without formal instruction, but rather by instinct, yet instead of being an extrovert and playing every wild drum fill imaginable like Keith did, Mo played only what she felt best complemented the sounds that her friends were making around her. There's a humble yet powerful grace with which she performed those songs that still captivates people all these years later. It just goes to show that you don't need to be a master technician to make music that will stand the test of time. You just have to love what you're doing and not be afraid to try something different from everybody else. Thank you, Mo. I hope this video reaches you, and I hope that you're reminded every day just how much the music that you and your friends created has meant to people all over the world, and how especially unique your role within that really was. Thanks to all of you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this documentary, and I look forward to bringing you another video very soon. Bye for now.
You can realize your goal, but you don't